Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'm glad to see that. I'm glad to see all of you here. I hope you have a really good live stream today. I have a very in-depth presentation that I want to do on one of UBERSOY's videos. As you might recall, I've had a few discussions with him in the past. I even had a live stream debate with him on Censored Anon's channel, which you can find in the you can find on my channel. I downloaded a copy of the video onto my channel, and I ended up watching last night after I went on the Fascio podcast and talked with the people there about just war theory from a Christian perspective. I ended up talking to and ta- I ended up talking to a few people. I ended up talking to a few people, and I was staying up late. And Ubersoy's video had come out while I was making the podcast, and I thought, well, this seems like an interesting watch, and so I watched it, and well, while it was entertaining, there were several errors in it that, well, not so much errors, but um, it felt like it was incomplete in a fundamental way. It felt like Ubersoy's video wasn't really giving me an alternative to the leftist that he was responding to. So Ubersoy's video um, was responding to a leftist named Adam, and Adam was trying to argue that the reason left-wing universities are dominated by the left is because left-wing is just because leftists are just so smart. They in the universities are these impartial centers of openness and learning, and I can't say it with a straight face. You can't tell. You probably can't tell, but I'm smiling because if anybody honestly believes that these universities are bastions of free speech and openness and curiosity and willingness to discuss ideas, they're kidding themselves. Um, and Ubersoy really rakes this guy over the coals for this, and it is a product of this guy's really just uh, unreflexive leftism. There's no self awareness involved in here. Like, I mean, whether you're leftist or not, um, am I coming through? Let's see. Oh, here we go. Well, there's seems some technical difficulties. Won't interfere too much, but whether or not you are a leftist, the it's important to be honest. Oh, there's lag to last. Oh, oh, oh no. Hey, can you um can you guys hear me now? Zoltanus, last man, right honorable Limbu, are you there? Um, uh, I'd like to. All right, I'm glad I'm back. Yeah, that was unfortunate. That was um my internet just getting. I don't know why it does that sometimes, but it it now works. Thankfully. Thank you, Lord Jesus, for making my internet work. Now I can continue with my planned talk of the day. Let's see. Well, where was I? Oh, yes, yes. So, self-awareness, right? There's a certain level of self-awareness that honesty requires. And uh, I mean, for example, I am a very scholastic oriented Catholic. I believe in the truth of scholasticism, and I and if you ask me to defend it, I'll give I'll give as solid of a defense of the overall framework as I possibly can, and show you its superiority over other uh, alternatives. That being said, I'm not going to lie to myself and say that scholasticism dominated the medieval period because it was just the best thing ever. All right, that's not the truth. That is not correct. What actually happened was that scholasticism dominated the medieval period because everybody and their mother was being educated by the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church was the dominant institution of that time, in comparison with the feudal the weaker political systems that populated Europe during the feudal era. So it's you can't actually say that scholasticism it was just the default because it was the best. All right, scholasticism is the best, but that isn't the reason why it dominated Europe in the medieval period. All right, now that so the thing so you can't actually just say, oh, leftism dominates the academy just because you think leftism is correct. That's that's just kind of silly, and it's also kind of naive too to assume that the smartest people in the room will always gravitate towards the truest ideas. That just seems a bit naive to me. So people have been coming up with alternative theories to why leftism is in leftism dominates academia. Besides, oh well, reality just has a left-wing bias because there's no reason to assume that the smartest people will always gravitate towards the best ideas. Case in point, the academia was overrun with socialism back in the day. And I mean, for most of the 20th century, most academics were enamored by the idea of socialism, and this sort of infatuation with socialism went back all the way to the 19th century too. Um, it was only by the way of the just blatant failure of the Soviet Bolshevik system that these academics were forced to admit through gritted teeth that their preferred system of politics was incompatible with reality, that there were certain political realities that made Marxism impossible to practice, at least in the form that it was constituted prior to the Soviet experiment. And I mean, leftists still today are it will praise the hell out of any third world socialist country when it looks like it's going to succeed. But then when it starts failing, they'll say, "Oh, that's not real communism. That's not real socialism." Right, right. Of course, so it's kind of ridiculous to say that these people will always just go for the correct ideas because history shows that they're not, and it's naive to assume this a priori anyway. So any adequate theory of leftist domination, in my mind, will have to account for uh, uh, it'll have to account for four different factors. First, it will have to account not simply why it is leftist in the current day, but also account for how it became leftist to start with, right? You can't just say that these universities they just cut they became leftist because all the leftists just discriminate against all the right wingers. Well, there was a time when these universities weren't leftist, right? Uh, And that brings me into the second criteria, which is that the theory must take into account the fact that most societies all over the world and throughout human history were not left wing. Leftism seems to be pretty unique to our modern condition. It's not even when the university system was founded in medieval Europe, leftism was not the dominant force there. It was medieval scholasticism that was the dominant intellectual movement in these universities. So it must account for that. Um, you'd have to account for the third factor, which is the perversity of left-wing views. The theory must explain why leftists are so bizarre and nonsensical. Not that they're simply just out of touch with reality, but also that they seem to be at war with reality. Not just that they are kind of eccentric, but that they positively thumb their nose at common sense, as it were. And then the fourth factor that a good theory of leftism has to leftist domination has to account for is the contingency factor. So leftism emerged within a Christian context. This is not news to anybody who's been paying attention to the history of leftism. Leftism is not something foreign to Christianity that was just inserted into it. It was something that grew out of it within that context and spread. And it's not, but at the same time, it's not something that's inherent to Christianity. If it was inherent to Christianity, then it would have taken root a long time ago, back when Christianity was starting to get dominant. Um, the holy Christianity during the Roman Empire was not leftist in this way. It's not very much clearly not leftist in this way, and you can I mean, why didn't if leftism was the essence of Christianity, then why didn't it appear at any other time in history? Why did it just appear during the 18th century onward? Just it doesn't add up unless you not unless you put in the extra effort to it. It has to be something that emerged from Christianity without it being essential to Christianity, in other words. So, what could have possibly done this? Um, I think we need to first start with an analysis of how power works according to what I believe to be the correct model, which is the juvenalian model. So, Chris, I sorry, I'm stammering now. Chris Bond actually wrote in his book Nemesis about something called the juvenalian model, that which is this theory that all human orders, all societies are made up of three parts. You have a center of power, you have a subsidiary power, and you have a periphery. The center of power is the dominant force, along which everything in society is centered around it. The center is what makes everything around it intelligible through its commands, its imperatives, and all human activity within that society is organized around this center. Surrounding the center is the subsidiary, which is which are these kinds of competing power centers that, while they revolve around the center, like planets revolve around the sun, they are their own power source of power, and so they have a certain degree of autonomy from the center. And if the center ever weakens, they could find themselves supplanting the center. An examples of these subsidiary powers would be things like the church, the aristocracy, and the different noble families, and even just family units in general. They sort of revolve around the center, the monarchy, but they, at the same time, they have a certain degree of autonomy. The monarchy can't force them to do everything it wants. The monarchy has to sort of play ball with them and do a back and forth with them, and because of the kind of autonomy that they have. And then the last group is the periphery, which are who are basically the commoners. They are the poor, they are the marginalized. And who the periphery are is going to depend on circumstances. Same with the center and the subsidiaries, but the periphery are always under the direct control of the subsidiaries and under the indirect control of the center. Now, the subsidiaries are the common enemy of the centralizing power, the central power, the center, and the peripheries. And the reasons for that is that the subsidiaries restrict the movement of both the center and the peripheries. The peripheries want to be able to sort of govern themselves, but the subsidiaries have directly impact their lives through rules. Example of this would be the serfs in feudal Europe being ordered by their lords to give them a share of their crops, or the church ordering these peasants to give them their tithes. Um, and then you have at the same time, the center is also restricted by these subsidiaries in that they have to, the kings back in medieval Europe had to ask the nobility for permission to use their armies, because the kings couldn't raise an army on their own. They had to appeal to the nobles and borrow their armies, and the nobles said, okay, you can have this army, but only for 80 days, and afterwards all our troops are going home. And so that put a sort of a limit on the power of the kings. And this is further um, in what put another limit on the power of the kings was this widely recognized right of rebellion, whereby if the nobles felt that the king wasn't following the traditions of the society, the nobles could depose him and replace him with someone who would be more amenable to their interests. And the king couldn't do that because, again, the king was recognized as the leader, but he was more of a first among equals. He wasn't this absolute monarch who could tell the nobility to do this and do that. This started to change with the rise of absolutism, and where you saw the kings issuing money, creating freemen, and doing all kinds of things to undermine both the church and the nobility, and thus increase their power. And it's through this process that eventually the king himself gets replaced by a kind of democratic process. But the centralization started by the king and continues, and this is where we get the start of leftism. So leftism, according to this institutionalist view of power, is the expression of two parts of the juvenalian dynamic: the self effacing, centralizing primary power, and the periphery, whose claims to equality and individualism are being promoted. The marginalized peripheral element is promoted by the centralizing power as a means of undermining subsidiary centers of power, thereby expanding its own power. So, for example, the leftist state. I'll give an example from history. Take the civil rights movement. So, the federal government is the center of power. The subsidiaries are the southern states that are resisting segregation, and the peripheries are these racial activists. So the federal government through different groups like the Fords and the Rockefellers promotes these kinds of periphery marginalized groups. And these marginalized groups then work as foot soldiers for the center against the southern states. And the southern states are treated as oppressors because they are limiting the actions of the periphery. And then the center of power can come in and say, well, this delegitimizes this power. So I'm going to take their privileges, their autonomy, and centralize power onto myself, thereby giving you periphery people the freedom to act. And so what happened? We had forced integration. The now, whether or not you agree with integration or not, whether or not you think that segregation was a bad thing, you have to wrestle with the fact that this was a power grab by the central government. The cent the and and this is something that the central that is unique to leftism, which I'll explain a bit later, is that the very nature of this juvenalian dynamic incentivizes the centralizing elite to hide their role, to present themselves as merely the facilitators of the periphery's demand. The process works regardless of whether or not the elites believe themselves to be mere facilitators, whether or not they believe they are centralizing power onto themselves, because the equality and individualism they advocate for cannot exist without a center of power. Thus, all those who strive for equality and individualism further the centralizing process. This is very this is very clear from what I explained earlier, that the kind of freedom and equality that liberals and leftists have long pursued is the freedom and equality, a kind of equality before a center and freedom from the subsidiaries, right? So when the idea of the individual comes from the idea of the free man. A free man was someone who was freed from all of his feudal duties as a serf, and he was no longer a serf. He was free, and he only had to obey the king and God. And since he only had to obey the king, since the king was the only political power he had to obey, he could be a foot soldier for the king against the subsidiaries. That's one less person that the subsidiaries can call upon as a resource to use against the king. And that's one more foot soldier for the king to use against the subsidiaries. You see how this works? You free people from the subsidiaries and hide the fact that you're still in charge. And this works whether or not the centralizing power knows it's a centralizing power or not. Because the process is sort of automatic at this point. And that's the thing. And that's the thing about leftist ideology. That leftist ideology masks this fact. Rightism, the right wing, rightism, by contrast, is an expression of the subsidiary centers of power, Edmund Burke's little platoons, who wish to halt this centralizing process and return the traditional autonomy these subsidiary centers once enjoyed. Rightists have argued against this kind of statist individualist alliance because they say that it destroys communities. The very structure of traditional communities depends on the ancient liberties and privileges traditionally given these intermediary institutions. You know, things like the family, the church, the aristocracy, etc. So, I mean, now recently, what's one of the things that has really changed in the past 50 odd years is that because of the rise of globalism, now the nation state has become a middling power compared to these centralizing international institutions. And so these and so nationalism has become a movement on the right wing because it works against the centralization process. Whereas before, back when the nation state was the one centralizing against the wishes of the aristocracy and the church, it would have been nationalism would have been used and seen as a left wing movement. You know, the people rising up against the aristocrats and gaining self determination. That is very leftist if you think about it. But now that the left has basically declared that nationalism is not very useful for their ends, nationalism is now right wing because it works against this globalization process and thus this centralization process. All right. So the thing you have to remember is that the groups and individuals that occupy these three roles, the center, the subsidiary, and the periphery, will vary according to contingent historical circumstances. However, the right and the left, as we know them today, emerged as visible forces only because of widespread blindness to the juvenalian mechanism that is unique to modernity. The past kings, popes, and emperors who made use of the juvenalian mechanism and aren't left wing. They're not left wing because they understood themselves to be agents of centralization rather than disinterested facilitators of equality and freedom. All right. So we have now that we have the basics of we have the what Marx called the base, which is these kinds of institutional power dynamics. Let's look at the superstructure. What is leftism as a superstructure? So, and for that, we turn to Edward Feser. Hold on, my dog is. All right, now religion. Ah, yes. So Professor Edward Feser, who is a person that I draw upon for a lot of my ideas, uh, to Edward Feser, leftism cannot properly be understood except in religious terms. This is because all leftist thought, whether it be liberalism, socialism, communism, scientism, progressivism, identity politics, globalism, anarchism, or something else, however ostensibly secular, is united by two irreducibly theological features. The first feature that all leftist projects share, that's theological, is that they are all essentially apostate projects, enterprises that have arisen amid Christian civilization to supplant it. Leftism, properly understood, is a counter religion that emerged out of Christendom with the intent of replacing the traditional worldview of the West. And they could have arisen and they could have only arisen within the Christian context because of the second feature that they have, that these projects are all heretical in the broad sense of the term. That is to say, they are all founded on some idea inherited from Christianity, like the dignity of the individual, human equality, a law-governed universe, a final consummation, etc., but removed from the theological framework that originally gave it meaning and radically distorted it in the process. Now, this last part is what Alasdair MacIntyre pointed out had happened with ethics in the West. The ethical framework of the medieval period that dominated Europe for centuries was predicated on a three-part structure: an untutored human nature, man as he could be if he realized his telos or purpose, and the moral precepts which enable him to pass from one state to the other. When the Enlightenment project rejected both Christian theology and Aristotelian philosophy, it eliminated any notion of man as he could be if he realized his telos. The elimination of an essential human nature, and with it, the abandonment of any notion of a telos, leaves behind an incoherent moral scheme. Liberals began making individualistic ethical systems that ironically had no conceptual relationship with what is good for individuals. And this is something that I've harped on about again and again, most recently in my moral universalism versus particularism video that I did a while back. Now, what drove these people to reject Christian theology and Aristotelian philosophy? Well, the reasons that Edward Feser and Alasdair MacIntyre give are primarily political. Anti-Aristotelian heretical views were promoted by centralizing powers looking to undermine traditional structures like the church and the nobility and to empower themselves. The Enlightenment thinkers saw Aristotle as the province of the Catholic Church. To endorse him and his metaphysics was to endorse scholasticism, and to endorse scholasticism was to endorse the institution that propagated scholasticism, the Catholic Church. There was thus a political incentive to create a theological and philosophical alternative to Aristotelian scholasticism. To put it in juvenalian terms, Aristotelian scholasticism was the expression of the Catholic Church, just as leftism is the expression of the centralizing forces that oppose the church. Now, the last man there, he says that I think evolution had a lot to do with the abandonment of telos. That you have a point there, but I don't think that's quite right because as Ed Feser points out, there were people that opposed this kind of worldview even before. I mean, there were people who opposed Aristotelianism even before Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin arrived onto the scene in the midst of this kind of Enlightenment project as sort of a. What Charles Darwin did was he took the individualistic ideas of his politics that were already that he was already swimming in, because he was swimming in a lot. He was a part of these radical political circles, and what he did was he took the sort of competitive individualistic attitude that a lot of these people had and applied it to the animal kingdom. And then he was able to give a scientific justification for individualism, which helped make individualism more appealing to people with a more conservative-minded attitude. So, I mean, that's what last. This is actually what. This is actually what Ed Feser said about the theory that evolution was the theory of evolution was the cause of this. He says the obvious answer behind what caused the rejection. uh, he says something. He said by. I'm sorry. I'm just losing my mind for some reason. Um, he first tries to establish that in order for something about the left-wing worldview to have a semblance of truth, something absolutely crucial to that to the Christian worldview in the age of faith, would have to have been refuted by modern science. And for it to justify a unique bias against the Western tradition, that something would have to be peculiarly Western. So and then he discusses evolution as the obvious choice. He says the obvious answer might seem to be the traditional idea that the human race began as a direct result of divine action in the Garden of Eden, an idea famously challenged by Darwin's account of evolution. But there are problems with this answer. For one thing, the hostility of intellectuals to the Judeo Christian heritage of the West, though it reached full throttle only in the 20th century, began long before Darwin ever set sail for the Galapagos. For another, the Western religious tradition was hardly the only one to take a supernatural view of human origins. Yet, while no Western intellectual takes seriously traditional Hindu, Chinese, or Native American accounts of human origins as scientific theories, neither do they scorn these traditional accounts. On the contrary, such accounts form part of the gorgeously diverse multicultural salad bowl mosaic that we are required unceasingly to celebrate. Even the most belligerent non Western religious traditionalists who resist the modern scientific study of man are treated with the greatest deference. Think of the US Army Corps of Engineers obligingly burying possible Kennewick man related evidence against American Indians' views of their ancestors' origins. By contrast, the fundamentalist Protestant who politely suggests at a PTA meeting that Darwinism ought at least to be open to debate is treated as if he ought to be in a museum display alongside other Neanderthals. Moreover, the Judeo Christian tradition, which had, after all, always taken human beings to have pretty lowly material beginnings, Adam was made from the dust off the ground, had never denied the evident anatomo bleh, the evident continuities between men and animals, was never primarily interested in the origins of the human body in the first place. Man's being made in the image of God was always understood instead to be a matter of his having the unique capacity for abstract reason, a capacity which has in the Western tradition been largely as the it has largely been regarded as the essential attribute of the human mind, and the mind's immateriality or inexplicability in purely physical terms has, from Plato and Aristotle to Augustine and Aquinas to Descartes and Leibniz to Popper and on down to a growing number of contemporary thinkers, always been a purely philosophical and thus rationally demonstrable conclusion as much as, or even more than, a theological presupposition. So the so the point is Darwinism was not not the cause of this. Darwinism was simply something that came along while this process was going on. Now, one can make the case that Darwinism accelerated this process, but it wasn't the cause of this process. This the cause of this process was the rejection of Aristotle and his views of things. And specifically the purposeful rejection of the idea of human essences and human purposes built into our nature. And so I really want to end this sort of talk with a more of a quote I got from a liberal pragmatist named Richard Rorty. He's a kind of a postmodern thinker. And he wrote the following in an essay titled Universality and Truth. Now, tell me if this sounds religious at all. Like, does tell me if this sounds religious in the slightest. Uh, this is the philosopher I'm talking about, Rorty. It seems to me that the regulative idea that we liberals, we heirs of the Enlightenment, we Socratists, most frequently used to criticize the conduct of various conversational partners is that of needing education in order to outgrow their primitive fear, hatreds, and superstitions. This is the concept the victorious Allied armies used when they set about re educating the citizens of occupied Germany and Japan. It is also the one which was used by American school teachers who had read Dewey and were concerned to get students to think scientifically and rationally about such matters as the origin of species and sexual behavior. That is, to get them to read Darwin and Freud without disgust and incredulity. It is a concept which I, like most Americans who teach humanities or social science in college and university, invoke when we try to arrange things so that students who enter as bigoted, homophobic, religious fundamentalists will leave college with views more like our own. What is the relation of this idea to the regulative idea of reason, which Putnam believes to be transcendent and which Habermas believes to be discoverable within the grammar of concepts ineliminable from our description of the making of assertions? The answer to that question depends upon how much the re-education of Nazis and fundamentalists has to do with merging interpretive horizons and how much with replacing such horizons. The fundamentalist parents of our fundamentalist students think that the entire American liberal establishment is engaged in a conspiracy. Had they read Habermas, these people would say that the typical communication situation in American college classrooms is no more Herrschaft free, domination free, than in the Hitler youth camps. These parents have a point. Their point is that we liberal teachers no more feel in a symmetrical communication situation when we talk with bigots than do kindergarten teachers talking with their students. When we American college teachers encounter religious fundamentalists, we do not consider the possibility of reformulating our own practices of justification so as to give more weight to the authority of the Christian scriptures. Instead, we do our best to convince these students of the benefits of secularization. We assign first person accounts of growing up homosexual to our homophobic students for the same reason that German school teachers in the post war period assigned the Diary of Anne Frank. Putnam and Habermas can rejoin that we teachers do our best to be Socratic, to get our job of re education, secularization, and liberalization done by conversational exchange. That is true up to a point, but what about assigning books like Black Boy, The Diary of Anne Frank, and Becoming a Man? The racist or fundamentalist parents of our students say that in a truly democratic society, the students should not be forced to read books by such people, Black people, Jewish people, homosexual people. They will protest that these books are being jammed down their children's throats. I cannot see how to reply to this exchange without saying something like, there are credentials for admission into our democratic society, credentials which we liberals have been making more stringent by doing our best to excommunicate racists, male chauvinists, homophobes, and the like. You have to be educated in order to be a citizen of our society, a participant in our conversation, someone with whom we can envisage merging our horizons. So we are going to go right on trying to discredit you in the eyes of your children, trying to strip your fundamentalist religious community of dignity, trying to make your views seem silly rather than discussable. We are not so inclusivist as to tolerate intolerance such as yours. I have no trouble offering this reply, since I do not claim to make the distinction between education and conversation on the basis of anything except my loyalty to a particular community, a community whose interests required re-educating the Hitler youth in 1945, and required re-educating the bigoted students of Virginia in 1993. I don't see anything Herrschaftsfrei about my handling of my fundamentalist students. Rather, I think those students are lucky to have found themselves under a benevolent Herrschaft of people like me, and to have escaped the grip of their frightening, vicious, dangerous parents. It seems to me that I am just as provincial and contextualist as the Nazi teachers who made their students read Der Sturmer. Der Sturmer. The only difference is that I serve a better cause. I come from a better province. So, in a nutshell, what this guy is saying is you have to accept liberal views on religion, sex, and race, or you are a bigot, comparable to an ignorant child at best and a violent sociopath at worst. There's no third option here. A college education, then, is not about studying the debate between different sides on these questions, but about indoctrinating students into one side by painting the other side as beyond the pale, possessed of no interesting arguments or thinkers to speak of, a political obstacle to overcome, rather than an intellectual and moral alternative to be considered. The program that Rorty and other professors who think like him are part of is precisely the agenda Edward Feser attributed to the modern university in The Opium of the Professors, which is the same agenda driven by the juvenalian mechanism described by Chris Bond. And I think between these thinkers, we have a really good theory of leftist domination. Now, when I talked to UBERSOY about this in the Telegram chat, he replied that this theory, he didn't like it because it sounded religious. And he couldn't really give a good answer as to why this theory was bad. Other than, well, it sounds religious, or, oh, leftism isn't a religion because, it's not traditional or something. I've already addressed things like this in a previous video on my 3 problems with secularism. But basically, the problem is that when we talk about the word religion as opposed to secular, these terms don't really have a principled distinction, other than one is a tradition that is old and the other is a tradition that was created during the Enlightenment. One is a tradition that serves centralization, and the other is a tradition that opposes centralization. That's not that this isn't any kind of there isn't kind of any kind of moral principle that or theological principle that distinguishes them. Right? And I don't think you need to be like this kind of Catholic to understand leftism as something created to replace Christianity that grew out of Christianity. I hope that clears up things. Now, Last Man says that Darwin did believe in group selection and not just individual selection. Well, that is true, but I'll just quote. I'm not attached to the view that Darwin is just copy pasting liberal individualism into nature, but I'll quote what Chris Bond has to say about Charles Darwin in his book on in his book on on the juvenalian mechanism. He says that with the arrival of Darwin's theory of evolution, the ethical system of egotism was provided with a supposedly scientific basis, but the connection between Darwin's theory and the power structure that brought about Auguste Comte's thought is even more clear. The clarity of this connection is apparent when we consider that Darwin's thought finds its origins in political economy, as Juvenal notes. and this is Juvenal speaking. He says, it was survival of the fittest, an idea which, as is known, was not suggested to Darwin by the spectacle of nature, but was, on the contrary, taken by him from the philosophers of individualism. Darwin's origin, and this is Bond speaking now, Darwin's original claims rested on a system within which the survival of discrete individuals in the shape of organisms came first, and whose sociability, like the individual of modern philosophy, therefore, was secondary. It is no wonder that, after the publication of The Origin of Species, liberals were exceptionally enthusiastic about Darwin's theory, as he was, in a sense, reflecting their philosophical presumptions back to them under the guise of a science. We even find this connection between Darwinian theories and modern liberal philosophy being made explicit in the likes of Darwin's bulldog, Thomas Huxley, who wrote of early man that, and this is Huxley speaking, as among these, so among primitive men, the weakest and stupidest went to the wall, while the toughest and shrewdest, those who were best fitted to cope with their circumstances, but not the best in any other sense, survived. Life was a continual free fight, and beyond the limited and temporary relations of the family, the Hobbesian war of each against all was the normal state of existence. The human species, like others, plashed and floundered amid the general stream of evolution, keeping its head above water as it best might, and thinking neither of whence nor whither. End quote. And then Bond says, and even more to the point, he declared that Darwin's work, that every philosophical thinker hails it as a veritable Whitworth gun in the armory of liberalism. It was within this ecosystem of self-interested individual organisms that Darwin was faced with the supposed problem that Comte was to name. Having basically imported political economy and egoism into the natural world, Darwin faced a problem similar to that faced by modern thinkers: how to explain sociability or behavior which could not be explained as immediately self-interested, but this time in the realm of biology. Darwin's initial explanation was to posit group-level selection, but this has proven unpopular and did not survive the development of the neo-Darwinian synthesis of the 20th century. And so, and he continues a bit on from there. Uh, Essentially, when we find with Darwinism is that the this kind of the problem you have with the standard Darwinian account is that it treats the sociability of these organisms as being secondary to, this kind of survival of the fittest mantra, which is essentially what Hobbesian political economy does. Hobbes believes that we were all naturally in this war of all against all, and then we suddenly decided to form a society because it was in our self-interest to. Whereas in older thinkers like Aristotle, they believed that we are just social animals from top to bottom, and that our origins are with the origins of the family and with the origins of society. All right, I think I've spoken in great length enough. I hope to see what UBERSOY says on this matter. Um, I'd love to have him on for another discussion. Uh, I'd love to invite him on, or he could invite me onto his channel. That'd be nice too. He can DM me if he wants to talk. All right. Until then, God bless everyone. If you like this video, please like, comment, share, and subscribe. Thank you, and have a nice day.